Okay, I am just so happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this. I want to begin by, I don't want to miss my chance to just tribute my beautiful friend Sharon Bayon, my sister, beloved sister in Christ, and her beautiful voice that to me is like an angel. And while I'm thinking about it, I want to also mention that we found out about Oilfield Christian Fellowship because her wonderful husband, who is also a pastor at Galilee Baptist Church, he knew we were in the oil business, and so he wanted us to have these Bibles that OFC has created. And that's how we found out about the Oilfield Christian Fellowship. So I owe them a big debt of gratitude, and I'm just grateful for them. Okay, before we begin today, I have a couple of things I put on the tables for everyone. Because my title is CGO, and I had some people ask me, does that mean Chief Governing Officer? No, I'm glad to report that is not what my role is at our company, and that's probably good for everyone. My title, as far as I know, I am the only CGO in the whole country because my husband made it up. And my title is Chief Giving Officer. So one of the things I put on the table is a brochure about something that is happening quietly in the background here in our community called Oil Patch Benevolence Fund. And that's just getting launched, but we wanted you to know about it, to be among the first to know. The other thing I put on the table, I gave y'all some coffee because it's just a gift, but also I left a brochure, a big stack of brochures about Christ-centered abortion recovery and education. I want you to know about that because I'm going to mention my experience with abortion, and I know whenever I speak on this topic, it's such a tender and traumatizing thing in a person's life. And it's 1 out of 3 people who've experienced abortion, so there's always people in the room that have had that experience and never told anyone. So if you'll just pick up a ton of those brochures and take them to your pastor, he'll be so happy that you brought them, and he'll know what to do with those. And I'm sure he'll be glad to hear from us because that organization is doing a really fine job in our area, in our region. Okay, so I want to get started, and as I do, I want to tell you a couple of things about the message I brought today. When the guys told me I was going to get to do this, I said, okay, here's my goal. I want every man in the room, because how often do Baptist girls get to talk to the men, right? So I want every man in the room to leave here feeling 10 feet tall. That's going to be my job today. Here's how I think about the oil business. You guys fuel the whole country. You provide power for everyone else. Can I get an amen on that? Thank you. Amen? Yeah? Okay. But nobody's thinking about you. And the oil price is down right now, and the industry is really struggling. So here's what my job is today, is to fuel you up because I know what good men you are. And I want you to leave here feeling powerful and empowered for the things that God has called you to do with your day today. So I just want to begin there, and I also want to say this. I'm going to mention this word maybe once in this whole speech, but this is the theme. The theme today is my husband's favorite word, and it's a word we love in the oil business. The word is freedom. So as you hear my stories, I just want you to think about how does that provide freedom for other people. Now I went ahead and I drilled really deep, and I picked 3 stories that are so personal that I've never shared them in public before. And the reason I did that is because I wanted you to know how much I honor you. I know many of the men in this room, and they're so dear to my heart. And I know what good leaders you are. And so I picked 3 stories that I hope will just encourage you. And I told Dave I was going to be talking about trajectory, so I'm going to begin there with a story that happened in 1983. In 1983, Korean airline flight 007, yes, that's 007, took off from U.S. airspace and flew over the Pacific Ocean. And when they got to the other side, they were in Russian airspace. And it was the height of the Cold War. So the Russians believed it was a spy plane, and they shot it down. 269 people, the crew, the passengers, and 1 U.S. congressman died that day. And the question became, how could a passenger plane accidentally be over Russian airspace? And the answer is in the trajectory, because a tiny mistake on this side of the Pacific became miles wide when they crossed the ocean. Now, we have a friend who's he's a retired Delta pilot, and he told us that was a major concern every time a plane left LAX. They were concerned that they would accidentally end up in Russian airspace. And the reason it mattered is all it took was for their navigator. In those days, they were still doing all this by hand. I don't know, maybe they still do it that way. They were doing all the computations themselves personally. And all they had to do was make a 0.001 degree error. And they could go from LAX to Russian airspace accidentally in the Cold War. So you can see that trajectories are important. But I don't have to tell you guys that because y'all are so many engineers in this room. So when I was talking to my husband David, like, what should I call this? I'm going to be talking about trajectories. What's a good name for this speech? He said this. He said, call it True Inclinations. And I said, oh my gosh, that is perfect. Is that a real thing? What is it? You know, I have no idea. So he explained it to me 3 times, in fact, or maybe 4. And now I'm so bold and brave in front of all these engineers, I'm going to just break it down for you, okay? So hang in there with me. Here's how it goes. When a company decides to drill a well, they start with a drill bit and they put a piece of pipe on it and they begin at the rig to turn and push that drill bit into the earth. And as they go down through all the different layers, it gets deeper and deeper. They keep adding pipe to the top, and that becomes a long string of pipe, and that's what they call it, the string of pipe. But as the rig is pushing down from the top and they cut through the different layers, they can hit a layer that is denser than the others. And what that essentially does is that puts pressure back up the hole. So what can happen is that long string of pipe can begin to bow, and that can push that drill bit off into the wrong angle. Now, the reason that engineers have job security, thank you. I know y'all right now there's engineers in this room thinking, man, I hope she puts this on the internet. The reason that we have job security for engineers in the oil business is when you spend $1 million drilling a well, you want to be sure they get a straight line, a true incline, or a true inclination. So that's what the engineers get paid for, to make sure that happens. Well, I'm just going to tell you, I don't know much about the oil business and true inclinations in that way. But I know a lot about the true inclination of my heart. And I know that sometimes my heart has a tendency to get off its course. So today I'm going to share 3 stories, and the first one is about how we all search for love, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my search. And the second one is about how a word of compassion can set the course of a marriage for a lifetime. And then the last story is about how forgiveness can just sneak up on us and surprise us sometimes. So I'm going to begin with my search for love. When I was about 12 or 13 years old, I came home from a Billy Graham movie like this. Mom, Dad, I have something important to tell you. I'm just going to step out here because I think you really need the whole effect. I have something important to tell you. I need for you to tell me that you love me more. And then I just waited to see what would happen. And my mom, bless her heart, she immediately began to say to me out loud, Kathy, I love you. And my dad, he wanted to. He did, and he did maybe a couple times, but it was so hard for him. So when I look back on that time in my life, I see 3 things about that. Number 1, I see that I was amazing in my ability to dig deep and figure out what I really needed. I mean, that's actually harder for me now, I think, than it was back then. And the other thing I see about that time is I trusted my parents so much. Kudos to them. I believed that if I could speak what my need was out loud, somebody in my family would definitely try to meet that need. And then the last thing that's interesting to me about that is I didn't know much of my dad's story back then as a young person, but I knew instinctively that he loved me and that he wanted to say that out loud to me, but it was really hard for him, and somehow that was tied to his childhood. I mean, that's pretty perceptive for a 12, 13-year-old kid, right? I'm kind of amazed when I think about that. Well, everybody in this room knows that when you go to a Billy Graham anything, they're going to offer you a chance to accept Christ, right? We all know that. And here's what happened with me. In a 0.001 moment of my life, I chose not to put my confidence and my trust in the most unfailing love that was out there. Instead, I rejected that idea, and I made a decision not to accept Christ in that moment. And that put me on a course of one after another disappointing friendships and relationships, and finally a very failed relationship, so that by the time I got to the University of Texas, I was thinking, man, this is not working. I need to try something different. And if you've ever been to the university, I know there's some Aggies in this room, but if you've ever been to the university, on the side of the administration building, right under that beautiful tower that's so famous, it says this: "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And engraved in stone is John, and then some Roman numerals. So naturally, as a freshman, I assumed that John was like some ancient guy, Roman emperor probably, and that was a quote from him, right? Fortunately, they have history courses at the university, so that was helpful. But anyway, I learned that year that Jesus actually said that. He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the light." But he said that first thing on the university too, he said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." So I accepted him my freshman year. And unfortunately, because some of that way of doing relationships had already been set in motion, it wasn't long after that that I became aware that I was in the midst of an unplanned pregnancy. And I made a choice to abort that child. And I just want to say that I know people like to say this is a woman's issue. For me, it's a very personal issue. But I know that every baby has a father, and so men, I really want you to remember we put those brochures out because men need attention on this issue too. It's a family issue, really. Well, I just knew I didn't want to be in that situation again. So I began to change my lifestyle and make different decisions. And one thing I decided is I'm not dating anymore till I get this figured out. No more dating for me. So for the next 3 or so years, I didn't date at all. And I just began to focus on making really good, building really solid friendships. In that time, I met David Craffey, and we became very close friends. And then about 3 years into our friendship, I could see the relationship was taking a different turn. And I knew I needed to tell him about my background, but I just couldn't do it. And that is pretty typical of people who are post-abortive. It's so difficult, it's so traumatizing that it's very difficult to talk about it. So I just didn't. And I married him anyway without telling him. And we were about 3 years into our marriage, or maybe 4, and we had these 2 darling babies, 16 months apart, beautiful daughters. And I was holding the newborn one, who's, by the way, now the president of Orbit Land Services, but beautiful little daughter, baby, and my little toddler who was only 16 months old, and I was treasuring every minute with them. And I was grieving and hurting for the baby I never got to hold. So that's when I began to go into counseling. And after I'd been there for a few months, I think, I knew it was time to tell David, and I had the courage, and I knew he really deserved that. He needed to know what I was dealing with so that we could begin to work past that together as a family. So I brought him into the counselor's office, and I set him on the couch, and I said, I have something important to tell you, and I had the counselor there to kind of help me if I stuttered, and here's what was going on in my mind. Will he reject me? Will he judge me? Will he condemn me? Will he wish he had never married me? Will he be angry because I didn't tell him? Will he want a divorce? That's what I was feeling. So I got my courage together and I told him. And he said the most compassionate words I believe I've ever heard. He wrapped his arms around me and he said this, Kathy, I am so sorry you had to go through that. Well, that put our marriage on such a solid and healthy trajectory that years later, when we hit about the 20-year mark and our marriage began to unravel and we were having all these communications issues, it felt like we never learned to communicate really, and here we were married 20 years. And I tell you, the Christians are always saying this, divorce is not an option. And I'm just here to tell you, divorce is an option. It is. And we all know that. We know that. You know, why would we even say that? Of course divorce is an option. So we were thinking about that. Should that be on the table for us? And you know what? As we were back in counseling, this time at the marriage counselors, and I'm sitting on the couch next to David, and here's what's going around in my head, like a halo. Where will I ever find another man who would love me like David with that kind of compassion? So, I have one more story to tell you. And this is one of my favorite ones. I call this story, My Dad Makes Amends. When my dad, remember, surprises and forgiveness will surprise us sometimes, so that's important. So when we'd been married just a brief while, my dad discovered Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was a life changer for all of us. And so immediately I got out the big book, and I'm looking to see what the steps are. What are those 12 steps? Because we're fixing to be living them, right? And step number 8 is making amends. So I knew that's what he was doing. I could see he was going around here and there, and I thought, I'm in the mix. He's going to ask me for forgiveness. I know he is. And I was ready. So sure enough, the day came, and he took me to this really cute little restaurant, and that was Dad's way. He liked to take us out to eat. And he sat me across the table from him in this cozy, little warm, quiet, dark place, very private and sweet. And he says this, okay, Kathy, what you got? And I said, okay, well, Dad, here's the deal. I've got these abandonment issues and trust issues, and I've been working on them, but I'm not getting anywhere with it. And I think it's because it's like second generational baggage, I think you had them, and you just passed them on to me. And boy, he agreed with that, because by then, I kind of knew his story. I remember when my grandfather was in World War II. I mean, no, I don't remember that actually, but I've heard the stories of it. So when World War II was happening, my grandfather went to Italy, and he fought. He was actually a medical doctor, so when the boys would come off the front line, he was right there in a tent set up as a medical hospital on the front lines, and he was patching them back up. And he ended up with a Purple Heart, in fact. But while he was doing that, my Dad's older brother, Uncle Ben, was rushed through college and sent to medical school at age 17 because they were so desperately in need of more doctors on the front lines. So the men in his family were gone. And here's this little 7-year-old boy at home, and his grandmother is dying. She's bedridden and really probably needed hospice care, but nobody had that back then. And in the midst of all that, where he and his mother are trying to care for the grandmother who's dying, my grandmother, my dad's mom, begins to have hallucinations. Now, this is in the day before we said the phrase mental health issues. So we don't know what happened to her, and we know some of the stories are sad because the treatments were so primitive at that time. But we know for sure she was in and out of coherency. So my poor daddy's trying to hold it together at home, on the home front, and all up and down his street, that's exactly what every other family is doing. They're just doing the best they can to hold it together while the men are away fighting the war. Well, I shared with Dad how I felt that it had made him feel abandoned and given him trust issues with women that were still affecting our relationship. And he totally agreed with me. He was so gracious about it. But then he surprised me with a story I would not have known if we hadn't had that sweet moment together. He told me this. Well, Kathy, I just went to the cemetery. You remember where your granny's buried, right? Yes, sir. I just was there recently with your mother. She went with me. And I went to my mother's grave, and I knelt beside her gravestone. And while I sobbed, your mother held me. And I asked my mother to forgive me for the bitterness and the resentments that I had carried all these years toward her. It wasn't her fault. But I forgave her for how I felt as a little boy trying to hold all that together. And we got that worked out right there on her grave, even though she was not alive when I finally was able to soberly deal with my hurt. So my dad shared that story with me, and it's a story I treasure to this day. I'm so grateful that he was willing to let me in on that moment with my mother and he at my grandmother's grave. And I want to just say, because we're filming and this will probably be something I can show my mother, I want to say how grateful I am that my mom loved my dad that way his whole life. And I believe her unfailing love for him healed his heart and allowed him to outgrow the wound that he suffered as a 7-year-old boy. And it certainly made a difference in my relationship with him, this moment that we had together. But he wasn't done surprising me. Dad was just full of surprises. So then he takes out a piece of paper and he unfolds it and he holds it in front of him and he looks at his paper and he looks at me and he says, "Okay, what else you got?" And I said, "Well, Dad, that's enough. I mean, and that's plenty. I'm done. I mean, I feel much better already. I think I'm going to be fine." He looks at his paper and he looks at me and he looks at his paper again and he goes, "Really? I've got 79 more things on this list." And I said, "Well, okay, we can do this 2 ways, Daddy. You can go through each item, all 79, and I'll forgive you for each one, because obviously I'm not worried about them. Or you could just trust that I'm a grown-up now and I can handle this stuff, and if there was anything, I would have already told you, or if anything comes up, we'll just talk again, and we'll be fine." So he looks at his paper, and he looks at me, and he folds up his paper, and he puts it in his pocket, and then he says something that is so profoundly the way my dad thought about life. He says this: "Let's order dessert!" Yeah. That was Dad. He always made it a party and a fun moment if he could. There was so much joy in his life. We really miss him. He's been gone about 2 years now. So I picked those 3 stories because I just wanted to honor you guys today. I want you to know how special you are to me. It is my privilege to know you. And I wanted you to leave here fueled up and ready for whatever God has for you the rest of your day or the rest of this week. And I don't know what that's going to be. You know, you may get back to the office and there may be some guy that just comes wandering into your office all the time, and you're thinking, doesn't he have a job to do, and doesn't he know the price of oil is down, and why didn't he let me get my work done? And maybe subconsciously he doesn't even know why he is drawn to you, but he is. Or maybe you're going to be sitting at the ball game tonight and you're watching your kids and your grandkids play ball, and some guy next to you is going to start up a conversation, and because of who you are, You're going to take that 0.001 opportunity to put that person on a trajectory that will be healthy for the rest of their life. I don't know. I know this. 30 or 50 years from now, when we're all long gone, that young guy sitting next to you at the ball game, he may be telling his grandkids, I was at a ball game 30 years ago, and I can't remember this guy's name, but he told me this, and it changed my life forever. Because that's who you are. That's who you are. So I don't know what you'll remember out of this speech today, but I want to say this. If you remember one thing, I want you to remember this. We are living in a culture right now that is desperately seeking love and failing. They are desperately, we all are really, but especially in our culture right now, people are just distressed. And they need someone to come along and offer them the comfort and the companionship and those 0.001 moments that will set them on the right trajectory. So if you only remember one thing, please remember this. In a culture that is craving leadership, you are that leader. Thank you.